In July of 1901, 14-year-old Willie Nickell was shot dead from ambush. He had been less than a mile away from home attempting to open a gate when 2 bullets struck him in the back. Skip ahead 2 years later, and noted assassin Tom Horn was executed for Willie's murder. In years prior, Tom had worked as an enforcer for various cattle barons throughout the state of Wyoming, and at the time of Willie's death, he was employed as a range detective on John Coble's Iron Mountain Ranch. And, well, let's just say that John Coble did not get along with the dead boy's father, Kels Nickell. Not only had Kels filed a homestead on land that Coble considered his own, but he then had the absolute gall to begin fencing it off. If that ain't bad enough, Kels nearly killed Coble during the summer of 1890. The two had been arguing at a train depot when Nickell whipped out a knife and slashed the rancher's belly wide open. Coble pulled through, and despite charges being filed, Kels Nickell pretty much got off scot-free. At least he did until nearly a decade later, when he committed the grave sin of introducing several thousand head of sheep there on the Iron Mountain Range. Word on the streets of Cheyenne was that Coble hated Kels Nickell like the devil hates holy water. He held a grudge ever since that knifing incident, and now that Nickell brought in all those sheep, Coble finally had a strong enough reason to go after both him and his land. As was the case with many other small homesteaders who opposed the larger ranchers, Kels Nickell was the recipient of an anonymous letter ordering he and his family to leave the area or suffer the consequences. And I reckon those consequences came to fruition on July 18th when his son, Willie, was murdered. Only question that still remains is whether or not Tom Horn was truly guilty of the crime. And I'll be honest, it ain't looking good. After all, Tom was in the area at the same time that the murder occurred. He even admitted as much, saying that he was checking to make sure that Nickell sheep weren't straying onto land owned by his employer, John Coble. What's more, we know that Tom had killed men on behalf of the cattle barons in the past, and these men were gunned down in the same fashion as 14-year-old Willie Nickell, shot from a distance with a rifle. There was even a flat rock that had been placed under the dead boy's head, a calling card of sorts that Tom often left out in the field to let the bosses know that it was he who completed the job. And then, of course, you've got the words of Tom Horn himself. In January of 1902, less than 6 months after the killing, Tom confessed to a deputy marshal that he was 300 yards away from Willie when he opened up fire, saying that it was, quote, the best shot that I ever made and the dirtiest trick I ever done, end quote. Sounds pretty cut and dry, right? Like I said, Tom would ultimately be found guilty in a court of law and sentenced to hang for the murder of Willie Nickell. That said, there are many to this day, including historians, that believe Horn was an innocent man, at least of that particular killing. And despite everything you just heard, they might be onto something. As it turns out, there was someone else who had an even stronger motive for going after Kels Nickell. We're going to look into all of this today. The events surrounding Willie's murder, the investigation, and the eventual trial and execution of Tom Horn. We'll also discuss other suspects, and I will be sharing my own opinion as to Tom's guilt or lack thereof. Trust me, if you're a fan of Old West history, you do not want to miss this one. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. There's a great scene in the movie Tom Horn between actors Steve McQueen and Billy Greenbush. McQueen, of course, was portraying the infamous Tom Horn, and Billy was playing the role of Deputy U.S. Marshal Joe Bell. During the scene in question, Deputy Bell introduces himself to Tom by saying something along the lines of, "What you were in the Southwest, I was in the Northwest." In other words, he was trying to convey that he, too, was a meaner-in-hell man-hunting son of a you-know-what, to which Horn simply replies, "Well, I was mostly out of work." Now, in real life, there was no Deputy Bell. There was, however, a very real deputy marshal by the name of Joseph S. LaForce. And as fate would have it, Tom Horn and Deputy LaForce did have quite a bit in common. Both of them spent time as cowboys in their younger years, and they both worked as range detectives up in Wyoming. Also, much like Tom, Joe had participated in the hunt for Butch Cassidy and his bunch way back in 1899. LaForce was appointed as a deputy under U.S. Marshal Frank Hatzel in October of that same year, and according to author and researcher Larry Ball, he had a, quote, reputation as a dogged manhunter who had used his gun when necessary. When the investigation into Willie Nickell's murder reached a fever pitch down in Laramie County, Joe was sent in on loan by the Marshal's office to assist Sheriff John Shaver. And when Shaver unexpectedly passed away, LaForce continued to work for his replacement, Sheriff Edwin Smalley. Matter of fact, it was Deputy Joe who arrested the first suspect in the murder of Willie Nickell. And this may be hard to believe, but that suspect's name was not Tom Horn. This is where things get interesting. You see, it wasn't just Tom's employer, John Coble, who considered Willie's father, Kels, to be an enemy. Truth is, Kels Nickell had the reputation of being a tad on the disagreeable side, and he had been feuding with his neighbors, the Miller family, for quite some time. And when I say feuding, I'm talking Kels and the Miller patriarch, James, had even traded bullets at one point, about a year prior to young Willie's murder. I'm not sure of the details, but according to the Wyoming Tribune, they were involved in a, quote, interesting shooting fracas near Iron Mountain, end quote. Aside from that, all I know is that neither man was wounded. Shortly thereafter, Kels accused two of Miller's sons, Gus and Victor, of trespassing on his land and cutting fence. Although the boys, both of whom were still teenagers, were ultimately found not guilty, tensions escalated to the point that James carried a loaded scattergun with him at all times. Just in case. Sadly, in August of 1900, the shotgun went off when it weren't supposed to, a negligent discharge that tragically killed James's 12-year-old son, Frank. The elder Miller, in his grief, blamed Frank's death on Kels Nickell. After all, if it weren't for Kels being so damn disagreeable, James would have never had to carry the shotgun in the first place, and Frank would still be alive. And the next time the two men came face to face in a restaurant in nearby Cheyenne, Miller pulled out a knife and sank it into Kels' shoulder. In turn, Nickell shucked out a revolver, but I guess reason won out and he refrained from squeezing the trigger. Not that it mattered none to James Miller. He was still fuming over the death of Frank 6 months later when he confronted Nickell's son, Willie, going so far as to point his shotgun at the young man. Now, this occurred just weeks before Willie was killed, so as you can imagine, Kels Nickell immediately suspected that James Miller was responsible for the murder. Or if not James, then one of his older boys like Gus or Victor. By the way, the attack on the Nickell family did not end with the death of Willie Nickell. It's long been theorized that whoever killed Willie had mistaken him for his father, and sure enough, just 17 days after Willie's murder, an unknown assailant put 3 rounds into Kels Nickell. Guess they was trying to finish what they started. Kels had been in the pasture with his daughter, milking a cow, when the shots rang out. Luckily for him, none of his vitals were hit, and he would make a quick recovery. What's more, he claimed to have positively ID'd the would-be assassins. Said it was his neighbor, James Miller, and one of his sons, either Gus or Victor, but he wasn't sure which one. And it still wasn't over. A few days later, as James was convalescing, several masked men rode right up into his property and killed dozens of his sheep. Needless to say, somebody was not a big fan of Kels Nickell, and to hear him tell it, that someone was his neighbor, James Miller. Okay, so how about that, huh? I guess maybe the idea of Tom Horn being an innocent man doesn't sound so crazy now, right? After all, justified or not, Miller did blame Kels Nickell for the death of his son, Frank. And James did, for a fact, aim a shotgun in Willie's general direction shortly before the young man was murdered. Now, I'm no detective, but just based on that alone, I would most certainly be looking to haul James in for questioning. And as fate would have it, that's exactly what Deputy LaForce did. And not just James either. LaForce also arrested the 2 aforementioned Miller boys as well, Victor and Gus. They wouldn't remain in custody long, though. The Laramie County District Attorney, a guy by the name of Walter Stoll, ordered a special inquiry into Willie's death. A coroner's jury was formed, and witnesses were subpoenaed, including many of the people we've just mentioned, especially Kels Nickell and his neighbor/enemy, James Miller. While this was going down, Deputy LaForce hit the field gathering even more evidence. As he began nosing around on the Nickell homestead, LaForce determined that whoever had shot Kels was operating alone. Remember, Kels said that his attacker was James Miller and at least one of his sons, but according to LaForce, there was only one set of horse tracks. Furthermore, as Deputy LaForce began questioning locals, he realized that this was far more complex than it first seemed. He even told his boss, Marshal as much, when the two linked up back in Cheyenne, saying that the killing of Willie Nickell was on account of a war between the cattlemen and the sheep herders, as opposed to feuding neighbors. It was LaForce's opinion that rather than James Miller being the culprit, it was one of the larger ranchers there in the Iron Mountain Range who ordered the killing. And, well, we all know who their attack dog is, right? Tom Horn. Meanwhile, District Attorney Stoll was coming to a similar conclusion. And to be honest, it does appear as if D.A. Stoll had Tom's number from the get-go. He was grilling folks not only about Tom's reputation, but his movements around the time of Willie's murder. Even when Kels Nickell was on the stand and accusing Miller, Stoll steered the conversation towards Tom Horn. The only problem was, when Tom's name got brought up, people started shutting their mouths, which I do think is a tad bit suspicious. If it was just a matter of 2 neighbors who didn't get along, then why was everybody so afraid of talking, especially when it came to Tom Horn? What was it about Tom that instilled such fear? Even the papers chimed in after the first day of the inquest, with one journalist writing, quote, "An attempt is being made to prove that Tom Horn, a detective and the employee of the cattleman, was the murderer of young Nickell. He was hanging about the vicinity of the Nickell Ranch for several days before the killing, apparently watching for somebody, but disappeared the day before the murder and has not since been heard of." End quote. This would change about 2 weeks later when Tom finally popped his head back up there in Cheyenne. And no sooner had he stepped off the train when D.A. Stoll had his ass subpoenaed. It wasn't under arrest, mind you, just had to answer some questions. According to Tom, he had stayed with the Miller family for 2 nights, just prior to Willie's murder. He had left their place on the morning of Wednesday, July the 17th, and of course it was the following morning, the 18th, when Willie was killed. And much to the astonishment of damn near everybody taking part in the inquest, Tom expressed doubt as to James Miller being the shooter. Tom readily admitted that he didn't care much for James or Kels Nickell either, for that matter. He referred to them both as the worst kind of people. He also stated that neither man possessed the courage needed to be a killer. While Horn claimed to have been just as surprised as everybody else that young Willie was gunned down, he didn't think that James Miller, nor his sons, had it in them to commit such an act. Maybe not the smartest thing in the world to say, right? I mean, by eliminating James Miller as a suspect, that would leave him, Tom Horn, as the next likely candidate, which, as I've already pointed out, he was anyway, at least in the eyes of D.A. Stoll and Deputy LaForce. Tom was also asked about a previous altercation he had had with Kels Nickell. Apparently, Nickell had made a fuss about Tom hunting game on his property and told Horn to keep to the road next time he passed through. But according to Tom, this never happened. Quote, "No, sir, I wouldn't allow 15 of the worst men in the world to tell me that." End quote. This was followed up by Horn pretty much just saying that he had the freedom to go wherever the hell he damn well pleased. Doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but this is something that Tom would continue to do all the way up until his sentencing, and it would not sit well with a future jury. You see, it wasn't enough for Tom to deny involvement or knowledge as far as the boy's killing was concerned, but he also had to let everybody know just what a dangerous man he was. We'll get to that soon enough. Like I said, this was all just part of an inquiry, and at this point, neither Tom or anybody else had been charged with Willie's murder. Be that as it may, District Attorney Stoll and Deputy LaForce were pretty much convinced that Tom was the killer. They just needed some evidence. Unfortunately, the citizens of Laramie County were scared shitless of Tom, so they weren't talking. But you know who was talking? That's right, our very own Tom Horn, or as the Apache called him, the boy who talks about himself. According to Larry Ball in his book Tom Horn in Life and Legend, Attorney Stoll, quote, expressed the opinion that Tom Horn's only weakness was his garrulousness. If the officers could get Horn to talk and thus incriminate himself, they could arrest him, end quote. Garrulousness, of course, is just a fancy way of saying someone who has the habit of talking too damn much. And this was indeed a weakness of Tom's, that and his consumption of alcohol, both of which Deputy LaForce intended to take full advantage of. Now, up to this point, Tom and LaForce had yet to become acquainted with one another. This changed shortly after the inquest when, according to Deputy LaForce, he struck up a conversation with Tom in Cheyenne, and the two had quite the visit. Apparently, the deputy just sort of casually implied that he knew Tom was guilty of the attack on Kels Nickell. Quote, I told him his sights must have moved or something was wrong with his gun, and asked him how come the old man to get away. Tom's reply was that it was early in the morning and the sun was not yet shining on the sights of my gun, or else it would have been different. End quote. Tom also joked about Kels' reaction to being shot, saying, you ought to have seen him run and yell like a Comanche Indian. So there you go, Tom readily confessing that it was he who attempted to gun down Kels Nickell back in August. Now, if you're anything like me, you may be wondering why in the hell Tom Horn would speak so openly with the deputy U.S. Marshal. First of all, remember who we're dealing with here. Tom loved talking about himself, period. Also, he was not aware of the fact that LaForce was actively investigating him. As far as Tom was concerned, they were two experienced manhunters just shooting the shit. Don't forget that Tom had once been a deputy marshal himself, and before that he was a sheriff's deputy. He had worked closely with law enforcement throughout his entire career, even as a range detective. So when it came to talking to the deputy, Tom didn't think nothing of it. It wasn't a suspect speaking with an investigator, so much as just two peers discussing business. And now that LaForce saw how easy it was to get Tom to speak his mind, all he had to do was figure out a way to get him to open up even more. That's when he concocted a plan to lure Tom in with a fake job offer, that of a range detective in Montana. I guess Joe figured that Tom would want to make himself scarce until the investigation died down, much in the same way he had done after killing Powell and Lewis back in 1895. And as it turns out, this was a correct assumption. LaForce sent word to Tom, telling him all about the job, and the two set up an appointment there in Cheyenne to hammer out all the details. Tom even went ahead and purchased a train ticket to Billings. That's how ready he was to get the hell out of Wyoming. He and Joe initially linked up in a local saloon, had a few drinks, and spoke briefly before Deputy LaForce excused himself. Said he had to run an errand, but asked Tom to meet him at the Marshal's office later on. Tom agreed, and the deputy scurried off to finish setting the trap. The day prior, he had drilled a peephole into a door leading to an adjoining office. LaForce also had that same door trimmed at the bottom, with at least 2 inches of clearance from the floor. Unbeknownst to Tom Horn, on the other side would be a local sheriff's deputy by the name of Leslie Snow, as well as a certified court stenographer, Charles Onhouse. They would remain hidden, and from their vantage point, they'd be able to hear every word that was spoken. And if all went as planned, Tom would be his usual chatty Cathy self, and any confession he made would not only be witnessed, but recorded. And yeah, it worked. Soon as Tom showed up at LaForce's office and drinks were poured, the two began talking about that job up in Montana. And just to further gain Tom's trust, LaForce had him sign a contract, followed by the deputy reading aloud a very flattering letter of introduction he had written for Tom's new employer. The pair continued conversing, and Tom asked whether or not his new boss was afraid of a little shooting. Deputy LaForce assured him that he was not, and Tom replied by saying that he knows that he shoots too much, but he had yet to have ever gotten one of his employers in trouble due to his penchant for violence. Just the segue that LaForce needed to get Tom to open up even more. He again plied Horn with flattery, saying that Tom was the best man to cover a trail that he had ever seen, and that when he was investigating the scene of Willie's murder, he never could pick up Tom's trail. To which Horn replied, "No, goddamn, I left no trail. The only way to cover up your trail is to go barefoot." LaForce then admitted that he never did figure out why Willie Nickell was killed, to which Tom cleverly explained, "I think it was this way. Suppose a man in the big draw to the right of the gate, you know where it is, the draw that comes into the main creek below Nickell's house where Kels Nickell was shot. Well, I suppose a man was in that, and the kid came riding up on him from this way, and suppose the kid started to run for the house, and the fellow headed him off at the gate and killed him to keep him from going to the house and raising a hell of a commotion. That is the way I think it occurred." End quote. Oh boy, Tom Horn's starting to sound a little bit like O.J. Simpson. Remember that book O.J. wrote, If I Did It? I'm sure Tom thought he was being smart with the way he was choosing his words, but I don't really think it was fooling anybody. Still, though, it wasn't quite enough, so LaForce tried a different tactic, asking Tom if he had his boots on when he ran to cut the kid off. Tom replied negative, and once again said that he was barefoot. Moments later, the conversation drifted to a local school teacher named Gwendolyn Kimmel. Now, I haven't mentioned her just yet, but Miss Kimmel lived with the Millers, who, if you'll recall, were next-door neighbors to the Nickells. It's thought that Tom and Gwendolyn were sweet on one another, and that was one of the main reasons he boarded with the Millers for those 2 nights back in July. Initially, though, Gwendolyn had vouched for James Miller, along with his boys. According to her, everybody was at home at the time Willie was murdered. Just thought I'd bring her up real quick because we will be hearing more from Miss Gwendolyn later on in the story. Next, Deputy LaForce asked Tom about his arsenal, spurring Horn to begin singing the praises of his .30-30 Winchester, and adding that he often liked to get in close to his targets. The closer, the better. When the deputy asked how far away he was when he shot Willie, Tom stated, quote, "About 300 yards. It was the best shot that I ever made and the dirtiest trick I ever done." Tom followed this up by saying that he had only wounded the boy with the first shot and was scared that he would get away, hence the second shot. When LaForce asked Tom if he retrieved his empty shell casings, Tom answered, "You bet your goddamn life I did." Finally, they decided to break for lunch, but not without LaForce asking him one final question. "I want you to tell me why you killed that kid. Was it a mistake?" To which Tom replied, "Well, Joe, I'll tell you all about it when I get back from Montana. It is too new yet." Now, just a quick word on Tom claiming to have shot Willie from 300 yards. That's a pretty good shot with the .30-30. It's not impossible, but if I were deer hunting, for example, it's not a shot that I would take. To me, a .30-30 is a great caliber for 100 or maybe even 200 yards, but I do kind of think that 300 is pushing it. With that in mind, on the day following Willie's murder, a surveyor inspected the scene of the crime and concluded that the shots were taken at 200 feet. So what's that, like 65 yards as opposed to the 300 that Tom was claiming? Much more realistic in my opinion. Hard to miss anything at 65 yards, be it a white-tailed deer or a 14-year-old boy. Just gotta lead them a little bit more. So yeah, like I said, Deputy LaForce and Tom broke for lunch, but they did reconvene afterwards, and Tom continued to incriminate himself. When LaForce asked about Lewis and Powell, two of Tom's victims from years earlier, Tom laughed and said that Lewis was the scaredest son of a bitch you ever saw. He then spoke of how much he was paid for the Lewis and Powell killings, and even said that he received the money from a bagman on a train ride between Cheyenne and Denver. Circling back to Willie's murder, LaForce asked about the stone that Horn had placed under the dead boy's head. Tom explained, saying that that's the way he hangs his sign out to get paid, just as a way of letting his employers know that it was he who did the job. The conversation then shifted towards how much money Tom was paid for killing Willie. I did find this sort of hard to follow, so I'm just going to read it out verbatim, and maybe you can decipher it better than I can. Deputy LaForce, did you ever have any trouble to collect your money? Tom, no, when I do a job of this kind, they know they have to pay me. I would kill a man if he tried to beat me out of 10 cents that I earned. LaForce, have you got your money yet for killing Willie Nickell? Tom, I got that before I did the job. LaForce, you got $600 for that. Why'd you cut the price? Tom, I got $2,100. LaForce, how much is that a man? Tom, that is for 3 dead men and 1 shot at 5 times. Killing men is my specialty. I look at it as a business proposition, and I think I have a corner on the market. So yeah, I'm not really understanding how much he was allegedly paid to kill Willie Nickell, and I'm not really sure who the other dead men are that he's referring to. The remark about shooting at somebody 5 times, I assume he's talking about the botched attempt on Kels Nickell, but I don't know. Either way, you've got to admit that does seem pretty incriminating, right? I mean, hell, Tom flat out said he was paid to kill Willie Nickell. And that's pretty much the gist of this meeting. Horn was planning on leaving for Montana the next morning, so that stenographer stayed up most of the damn night just typing out copies of his notes. Once that was complete, the evidence was presented to the district attorney Stoll, and a warrant was issued for Tom's arrest, which occurred at the Ocean Hotel at around 11:30 the next morning. Tom was just sitting on a couch in the lobby, talking with a railroad detective, when Sheriff Ed Smalley and his undersheriff, Richard Proctor, made the arrest. There was concern as to whether Tom would try to resist, but much to the relief of the lawmen, he submitted without putting up a fight. Hell, truth be told, Tom even started cracking jokes, even as they were escorting him to the nearby jailhouse. And I mean, why wouldn't he? After all, Tom had been in trouble before. Anytime he got crossways of the law, his rich employers just swooped in and got him off the hook. Guess he figured this time wouldn't be no different. Sure enough, his boss, John Coble, soon began collecting money for the defense. Only problem was the other cattle barons there in southeastern Wyoming didn't want nothing to do with it. I guess times were changing, and they no longer wished to be associated with the likes of Tom Horn. Still, though, Coble resolved to continue supporting his loyal attack dog, and even ponied up a cool $5,000 down payment for the legal fund, which nowadays is a little over $180,000. Rather than Tom being represented by just some local podunk ambulance chaser, Coble ensured that he'd have a defense team comprised of some of the best attorneys money could buy. Preliminary hearings were held on January 23, 1902, and up to this point, Horn still had no idea that LaForce had been working against him. And when that particular bombshell was revealed in court, along with the confession, even Tom couldn't hide his astonishment. There was quite a bit of commotion at the defense table, but they soon regrouped and put their own little spin on things. Rather than Tom's words being a confession, they explained him away as mere braggadocio, or boasting, and that Tom was essentially just bullshitting with who he thought was a fellow, quote, bad man and killer. And just to further throw shade on the confession, they were also able to scrounge up several eyewitnesses who stated that Tom was extremely inebriated during the meeting with Deputy LaForce. In other words, if he was drunk off his ass, could he really be held responsible for whatever he might have said? Now, following this, Tom would have to wait another 9.5 months for the actual trial, which began at 9 a.m. on October 10th, 1902. Now, it was assumed that the trial would end up dragging on for quite some time, but as it turns out, things progressed rather quickly. The jury was selected in just a few hours, and later on that afternoon, the prosecution began laying out their case. On day 2, Mary Nickell, along with her son Fred, gave a tearful testimony. Evidently, Fred was the one who found his brother's body. And this was followed by the dead boy's father taking the stand. If you'll recall, Mr. Nickell initially thought that his neighbor, James Miller, was to blame for Willie's death. But for some reason, by the time the trial began, he had had a change of heart and took to blaming Tom Horn. What caused this change of heart, I do not know. But there just ain't no two ways about it. By the fall of 1902, Kels Nickell was adamant about Tom Horn being Willie's true murderer. Be that as it may, you better believe that the defense attorneys were going to do their level best to capitalize on Nickell's feud with James Miller, which they did during the cross-examination. Gotta introduce a little reasonable doubt. After that came even more witnesses. A guy by the name of Frank Irwin testified that he saw Tom riding north of Laramie at around 11 o'clock in the morning on the day Willie was killed. Said he was riding on a large, dark bay that looked very tired, as if it had been ridden hard. Like, oh, I don't know, someone putting distance between themselves and a damn murder scene. I guess the idea was that Tom rode hell for leather to get to Laramie as soon as possible and establish an alibi. Next came a livery operator from Laramie who confirmed that Tom's horse was indeed plumb tuckered out by the time they arrived in town, something that the defense countered by pointing out how hot it was there in July, and that even a casual ride in that sort of a heat could have caused the pony to work up a lather. In other words, just because the horse looked worn out doesn't necessarily mean that Tom was riding at a full gallop over a long distance. Next, the jury heard from the wife of James Miller, along with 3 of their kiddos, all documenting Horn's movements leading up to the fatal day in question. Speaking of the Millers, I know I mentioned this earlier, but way back in August, during the initial inquest, that schoolteacher that boarded with them, Gwendolyn Kimmel, had vouched for James and the boys, stating that they were all home eating breakfast at the time that Willie was gunned down. Much like Kels Nickell, however, Gwendolyn would soon change her tune. Although she refused to testify during the trial, she actually ended up fleeing the state. She later became a very strong supporter of Tom's and stated in no uncertain terms that James Miller had confessed to her that it was he and his son Victor who killed Willie. Who in the hell is telling the truth here? A lot of twists and turns in this story, that's for damn sure. Following the Miller testimony, the juror heard from that stenographer who read aloud Horn's confession. Now, as far as this confession goes, it's often pointed out that in a modern court of law, it would most likely be inadmissible. Truth be told, there was a retrial decades later in the 1990s, and sure enough, Tom's confession to Deputy LaForce was not admitted. Not really sure why this is, though. I actually consulted a couple of lawyers myself, and they were of the opinion that it would just depend on Tom's level of intoxication, as well as the state in which the trial was held. Jailhouse confessions are a thing, and they are absolutely admissible, so I'm not really sure why Tom's confession to Deputy LaForce would be any different. I guess if it was somehow established that he was falling down stumbling drunk, then sure, but I don't really think that was the case. That said, I am most certainly not a lawyer. Was I once on jury duty? Yes, I was. Have I read dozens of John Grisham novels, along with watching My Cousin Vinny at least once a year since I was a kid, especially the parts with Marissa Tomei? Yes and yes. But I'm still not a lawyer, so I really can't speak on what should or should not have been admitted as evidence. Here's another thing about the confession. Although it does seem pretty damning, we do not know what tone these words were originally said in, right? Remember, Tom's words were recorded on paper, and one of the problems with communicating via the written word, whether it be a text or email or even leaving comments on YouTube, is that the person reading has no idea what sort of tone you're implying. This is especially true when using sarcasm. For instance, when Tom said that killing Willie was the best shot he had ever made, did he say it in an ominous tone? Yeah, that was the best shot I ever made. Or was it in a joking or even facetious manner? Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, sure, it was the best shot I ever made. Followed by a wink and a sarcastic shake of the head. We'll never know, but I think all of us say things, me especially, on damn near a daily basis, that if read out loud verbatim in court in front of a jury, would make us sound pretty bad. Another point of contention was the fact that stenographer Onhouse admitted to not writing everything down. Might not sound like that big of a deal, but one has to wonder what else was said. What exactly did Onhouse omit and why? As the trial went on, it became clear to all in attendance that things were beginning to wear on old Tom Horn. When the proceedings began, he appeared carefree and was even winking at his friends there in court. As time went on, however, and more witnesses were heard from, Tom began to crack. Not only was he chewing tobacco like it was going out of style, but he had also developed a facial tic and even began sneering at the press. Now, I don't want to sit here and rehash the entire trial, but I can assure you that many witnesses were heard from. I think all total, the defense had over 50 people take the stand. And there was a ton of conflicting testimony. From everything as to whether or not Tom was drunk on the day he confessed, to what point he actually arrived in Laramie, and even what caliber of bullet had struck the victim. I would like to highlight a few of what I consider to be the more important revelations, though. For instance, according to the prosecution, Tom's confession to Deputy LaForce was not his only confession. Back in the fall of 1901, a couple of months after Willie's murder and just prior to his arrest, in January of '02, Tom had made a trip to Denver. A local named Frank Mullock testified that Tom had gotten drunk there in a Denver saloon and told him and two of his associates pretty much the same thing that he had told Deputy LaForce, that Willie was the best shot he had ever made and the dirtiest trick he had ever pulled. These claims were somewhat shot down by the defense, though, when they proved that Tom had been recovering from a broken jaw at the time he allegedly confessed to Mullock. Even the doctor who treated Horn stated that he had a full facial cast and could not have been able to speak. And maybe that's true, but fact is, Tom was definitely in Denver that fall. That much is a proven fact. And he was most definitely drinking in the saloons and running his mouth, which is how he ended up with a damn broken jaw to begin with. Whether or not he made that confession about killing Willie, I can't say, but he was in Denver. Another bombshell from the prosecution came in the form of a blood-stained sweater. Tom was actually forced to try it on there in court, but he seemed to struggle with getting it to fit over his head. Horn's lawyer, a guy by the name of Jonathan E. Cochran, then began to exclaim, quote, "If the sweater don't fit, you must acquit." No, sorry. Got my famous murder trials mixed up again. In all seriousness, back in July, directly following the murder of Willie Nickell, Tom dropped off a dirty sweater at a shoe store in Laramie, presumably to have it cleaned. When the shopkeep noticed all the blood, he handed it over to law enforcement, who in turn gave it to District Attorney Stoll. And what's more, Tom readily admitted that the sweater was his, at least at first. When he got on stand, though, he changed his tune and said he had never seen it before, and not only that he had never in his entire life even owned a sweater, or even a jacket. As for the defense, they had their own star witness in the curiously named cowboy Otto Plaga. Now, Otto and Tom knew each other well. Matter of fact, Otto had helped Horn arrest Eva Langhoff back in 1893. And according to Otto, he saw Tom early in the morning of July 18th, the same day and roughly around the same time that Willie Nickell was murdered. The sighting occurred 25 miles from the Nickell homestead. So given that time frame, and assuming that Otto was telling the truth, this was a pretty decent alibi. After all, it would have been impossible for Tom to have been in both locations at the same time. The defense even had Otto's stepfather take the stand and back up these claims, stating that Otto had came home later on that day and told him about seeing Tom Horn riding by. In an ironic twist of fate, Tom had previously been asked about Plaga's reputation during the preliminaries, and Horn stated that Otto was unreliable. Fucking Tom, man. Dude had one eyewitness who can vouch for his innocence, and he cannot help himself but spouting off about the man's lack of credibility. And if that wasn't bad enough, when Tom finally got on the stand during the actual trial, he would go on to contradict Plaga's alibi. Whereas Otto said that he saw Tom early in the morning, Tom claimed he wasn't in that particular area until much later on in the day. In other words, Tom had just taken the only alibi he had and took a big steaming dump of Old West hitman excrement all over it. And honestly, man, it was Tom Horn's mouth that was his final undoing. Why his lawyers even allowed him to take the stand is beyond me. While Horn steadfastly maintained that he was innocent and had nothing to do with Willie's murder, he also just could not keep his mouth shut. Especially upon cross-examination, when Stoll began prying into Tom's methods of preventing stock theft. Horn basically admitted that he handled his business outside of the judicial system. Don't forget that Tom hadn't been responsible for anybody's arrest there in the Iron Mountain region since 1893, damn near a decade before the trial began. Yet he did continue to work as a stock detective, and I highly doubt that Coble and the other ranchers were paying Tom just to sit around and twiddle his thumbs. If Tom wasn't arresting anybody or otherwise bringing charges against him, then he must have been imposing the boss's will in some other way, i.e. intimidation or just outright violence. To hammer this point home, Attorney Stoll asked Tom about his actions down in Browns Park when he killed Matt Rash and Isom Dart. The defense attorneys objected and Stoll rephrased the question, asking Horn about what he had meant in a previous statement where he claimed to have prevented the theft of livestock in Browns Park, and Tom's answer was a bit bizarre and rambling. He started off by saying that stock detectives are, generally speaking, a group of unprincipled loafers and scam artists who take their employers' money but perform no meaningful work. By contrast, he, Tom Horn, was an energetic and principled man who remained on the job until all thieves were either caught or ran off. Said that he didn't care about how big or bad the outlaws were, that he could handle them, and the threat of rustlers never cut much of a figure with him. According to Larry Ball in his book Tom Horn in Life and Legend, quote, in response to one of the prosecutor's questions, Horn insisted on giving a more detailed explanation, believing that the jury would understand and be more sympathetic. The more he talked, the more vulnerable he became. The more vulnerable he made himself by talking too much, the more the jury saw that he was capable of killing for money. Thanks to his propensity to boast and let his big ego run away with him, Horn thoroughly incriminated himself. End quote. And by the way, as far as Tom's own reliability goes, or his truthfulness, he also testified that he had never killed anybody, a laughable assertion that one newspaper described as follows, quote, "This man, the pride of whose life had been to be pointed out as the notorious killer and hired wolf of the cattle barons of Wyoming, pleaded earnestly that he was only a miserable braggart." End quote. Really, at the end of the day, the strongest defense that Tom had was the testimony of Otto Plaga, which he helped to destroy, and his own claims that LaFour's confession was just boastful joking or joshing, as he referred to it. Of course, there was also a little reasonable doubt presented in the form of James Miller and his sons. They had motive as well, and although Gwendolyn Kimmel did clear them in the preliminary hearing, she was nowhere to be found at the actual trial. As far as the prosecution, they were successful in bringing forth 6 witnesses who testified hearing Tom confess to Willie Nickell's murder. You had Deputy LaFours and Deputy Snow, along with that stenographer, and then in Denver there was Frank Mullock and his 2 buddies. And while Tom said that he never spoke to Mullock, his words to Deputy LaFours were never denied. He owned up to them, but just said that they were spoken in jest. The prosecution was also successful in showing a motive. Everybody knew that Tom worked for John Coble as an enforcer, and everybody knew the history between Coble and Kels Nickell. The trial finally came to an end at around 11:30 in the morning on Friday, October 24th. And later that evening, at approximately 4:35 p.m., the jury returned with the following verdict. "We, the jury, impaneled on the above entitled case, do find the defendant, Tom Horn, guilty of murder in the first degree." Then, less than a month later, Tom received his sentence. "It is ordered, adjudged, and decreed that you, Tom Horn, be confined to the 9th day of January, 1903, on which day, between the hours of 9 o'clock in the forenoon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you will be taken by the sheriff of Laramie County to a place prepared by him, and there hanged by the neck until you are dead." Now, as bad as that sounds, Tom did seem to remain unbothered, telling anybody who'd listen that he wasn't dead yet. Truth is, I think Tom felt pretty confident that his attorneys would be able to file an appeal. Maybe he'd get another trial, or maybe his cronies in the WSGA would pull some strings and get the governor to issue a pardon. There was even talk that, barring any of that, an army of cowboys would simply descend upon the jail and whisk Tom away to freedom. As it turns out, that was not the case. Tom's lawyers had no luck with the appeal process, and the governor, although very active in reviewing the various pieces of evidence, did ultimately refuse to grant Tom a pardon or even a commutation. And that may have partially been due to Tom's failed attempt to bust himself out of the clink. Now, this is a wild story in and of itself, not just because it involves a daring jailhouse escape, but it also just goes to show that Tom was no longer living in the Old West that he had grown up in. Things had changed quite a bit since he first arrived in Wyoming, and Tom apparently had not been able to keep up with the times. On the morning of Sunday, August 9th, 1903, Tom and another inmate overpowered Under Sheriff Richard Proctor and forced him to open up the weapons safe. Tom grabbed a pistol, one of those newfangled semi-autos, but the only problem was he didn't know how to operate the damn thing. He even aimed it at Proctor and squeezed the trigger, but nothing happened. At the same time, another deputy, Leslie Snow, stepped inside only to find the business end of a rifle pointed at him in the hands of Tom's accomplice. Snow slammed the door, fired off a few warning shots into the air, and took off running until he found a telephone to call for help. In the meantime, both Tom and his fellow escapee sprinted for freedom, both of them splitting up and going their separate ways. As Tom ran alongside the automobiles parked next to the church, a good Samaritan named Aldrich began taking pot shots at him through a window. Once again, Horn tried to fight back, but he just couldn't get that pistol to fire. I don't know if he wasn't aware of how to flip the safety off, or he didn't know you had to rack the slide back to chamber around, or what, but while Tom most certainly knew his way around revolvers and lever-action rifles, he was clueless when it came to these modern firearms. Aldrich managed to graze Tom's scalp with a bullet that stunned him long enough for Deputy Snow to arrive and begin beating Tom over the head with the butt of his rifle. There's a great photo of Tom directly following this escape, being led back to the jail. If you're curious to check it out, I did just share it over on the Wild West newsletter. Link below if you'd like to give it a look, or you can go directly to wildwestjosh.substack.com. You know, it does kind of beg the question, though. If Horn had not tried to escape, would he have been granted a pardon? Maybe. This trial did occur when Teddy Roosevelt was in office, and Teddy loved his Old West cowboys. I have no doubt that if Tom had his sentence commuted to, let's say, life in prison, that within just a few years, if not months, Teddy would have seen to it that he'd be released, especially considering Horne's actions in Cuba. I certainly can't blame the man for trying to escape captivity, but at the same time, this sure as hell did not help Tom's case any, especially considering that he had tried to kill Proctor. If, by some stroke of luck, Tom had instead gotten his hands on a Colt revolver chambered in .44-40, Under Sheriff Proctor would have almost certainly died in a puddle of his own blood there in the jailhouse. As it were, Proctor would live long enough to be the last face Tom saw before a black hood was placed over his head. Now, the execution was initially set for November 20th, 1903, but ended up getting extended to December 3rd. And for what it's worth, I gotta admit that Tom took his medicine like a man, especially considering how unorthodox the execution was. First of all, it would be a private hanging. The scaffold was built inside of the jailhouse, believe it or not, so Tom had to sit there and listen to him build the damn thing right outside of his cell. Also, this was the first time that a water gallows was ever used, at least to my knowledge. The contraption, also referred to as a Julian gallows, after the guy there in Cheyenne who invented it, James Julian, was powered, oddly enough, by water. Once again, if you've ever seen the movie Tom Horn, they do a pretty good job of portraying this. Essentially, Tom would stand on the scaffold with a trapdoor directly underneath him. His weight would trip a lever, which in turn would pull a plug from a barrel of water. As the barrel drained, a float would drop, which caused yet another lever to yank the latch on the trapdoor, after which the condemned would fall through just like a normal hanging. I guess the idea was to alleviate the guilt of having somebody act as the executioner. Kind of like how in firing squads they used to supposedly have one of the rifles loaded with blanks. With Tom activating the gallows with his own weight, and the water and the levers doing the rest, everybody could go home with a clear conscience, I guess. On the morning of the execution, Tom was reported to have been in a foul mood, but once he got some breakfast in him, he seemed to reconcile himself to his fate. Not gonna lie, that pretty much sounds like every morning for me. Tom asked for a Bible, as well as some magazines, and as he waited, he pinned a letter to Under Sheriff Proctor, apologizing for beating on him during the botched escape. At approximately 9 a.m., Horne received his last visitor, his boss, John Coble. The rancher was overcome with emotion, and Tom told him, "Keep your nerve, John, for I'll keep mine." By the way, the execution was supposed to take place at 9 a.m. on the dot, but Sheriff Smalley had it put off long enough for Coble to make one final and ineffectual appeal to the governor. And by 10:55 a.m., the sheriff could wait no longer. Those who were invited to view the execution were then marched past Tom's cell as they took their seats. As it turns out, many of them were members of law enforcement, which spurred Tom to remark that they was a mighty sick-looking lot of sheriffs. Speaking of sheriffs, moments later, here comes Smalley stepping into Tom's cell, along with Deputy Snow and a Reverend Rafter. Tom put his cigar out and calmly followed him to the gallows, with the good Reverend in the lead. Once on the scaffold, and per Tom's request, Proctor gave the go-ahead for two of Horne's buddies to sing the song "Life is Like a Mountain Road." After they were done, Tom was asked if he'd like to say anything, but he declined. He was also given one last chance to publicly confess, which he also declined. Even to the bitter end, Tom maintained that he did not kill Willie Nickell. As the leather straps were being placed around Horne's arms, he noticed that the man doing the tying, his old friend T. Joe Cahill, had a case of the shakes. This prompted Tom to crack a joke at Cahill's expense, followed up by a little marriage advice. Apparently Cahill had recently tied the knot, and Tom told him to treat his bride right and that he hoped they lived happily ever after. Once again, noticing the nervousness of those around him, Tom proclaimed, "Don't be nervous, boys, you're only doing your duty." At this point, Sheriff Smalley placed the noose over Horne's neck. Tom complained that it was pinching, so the sheriff adjusted it as Reverend Rafter said a prayer. Once this heavenly supplication was finalized by an amen, Tom held his head high as Proctor placed a hood over it. The undersheriff then asked Tom if he was ready, and Tom replied that he was. It was now 11:07 a.m. As Tom Horne's weight hit the trap door, there was an audible clicking, followed by the sound of running water. And as the water continued to drip, Tom spoke up for the final time. "You're not getting nervous, are you, boys?" No sooner had he spoke than the water ceased dripping, and then silence. For the next excruciatingly long 31 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Then all of a sudden, there was a loud cracking noise as the trapdoor finally gave way. Tom fell through and spent the last 16 minutes of his life just slowly choking to death. Physicians stood on each side of him, checking his pulse, until at 11:24, Tom Horne's heart finally stopped beating. The body was quietly transferred to a funeral parlor, where he was then placed in a copper-lined casket, complete with white satin and silver trim. This, along with Tom's funeral, was paid for by John Coble. As it turns out, though, Tom would not be buried there in Cheyenne. His brother Charlie agreed to accept the body and have it buried down in Boulder, Colorado, where he and his family were living. And by the time Horn arrived there in Boulder, there were hundreds of spectators lining the train depot, just hoping to get a look. In order to appease the mob, Charlie Horn had the casket opened and allowed the citizens of Boulder to file by and pay their respects. Ironically, none of the local churches would allow the funeral of a murderer, so Tom's final going-away ceremony occurred in a funeral parlor. Papers reported that it was the largest funeral that Boulder had ever seen, with an estimated 2,500 people in attendance. So it were that Tom was laid to rest there in Boulder's Columbia Cemetery, and it's there where he remains to this day. Now, as to whether or not Tom was truly guilty, this is probably something we'll be debating all the way till Gabriel blows that horn. Even the historians are in disagreement. Guy I've quoted often in this series, a verifiable expert on all things Tom Horn, Larry D. Ball, tends to believe that Horn was indeed guilty. Chip Carlson, however, yet another Tom Horn expert, disagrees. Mr. Carlson is no longer with us, unfortunately, but he was very passionate about Tom's innocence. I have not read his book, Tom Horn, Blood on the Moon, in full, but what little I have read, it does seem apparent that Carlson did quite a bit of research, so he wasn't just talking out of his ass. Someone else that I have a lot of respect for, the great Marshal Trimble, also thinks that Tom was most likely innocent. As for me, honestly, I'm still on the fence. Just looking at the case in hindsight, knowing everything I know about Tom's past and his personality, I think he probably did kill Willie Nickell. I'm just not a big believer in coincidences. Horn was a hired killer, and he had killed on behalf of the cattle barons in the past. That is a fact. And it just so happened that the cattle barons, who Tom worked for, were not big fans of Kels Nickell. Tom was in a very close proximity to the Nickell homestead at the time of Willie's murder. The Nickells had previously received a letter telling them to leave the area, and Willie Nickell did have a flat rock placed under his head. Also, he was killed from ambush, right? It doesn't take a genius to figure out that these are all the clear calling cards of Tom Horn. And let's not forget, the man did not have a believable alibi. That said, James Miller also had motive. He, much like John Coble, hated Kels Nickell with a passion, a hatred that I think was at least partially deserved. I'm not sure if I mentioned it earlier, but apparently Kels had even threatened to whip James's son Victor on numerous occasions, and he even let his sheep trample the Miller's garden. James blamed the death of his other son, Frank, on Kels, and James had, allegedly, snapped a shotgun at young Willie shortly before his death. Also, this didn't come to light during the trial, but there are many who believe that James Miller bribed Deputy LaForce into ignoring he and his sons, and instead focusing the investigation on Tom Horn. That's another thing that has to be taken into account. Between Tom being found guilty and his execution, we're talking a span of like 13 months, there was a ton of new evidence submitted. It seems that neither Tom's lawyers nor his old friend John Coble had given up on the appeal process, and much of this evidence was reviewed by then-acting Wyoming Governor Fenimore Chatterton. Remember that school teacher I mentioned earlier, Gwendolyn Kimmel? Back during the inquest into Willie's murder, she vouched for the Millers and said they had all been home eating breakfast at the time that the killing took place. For some strange reason, she then had a change of heart and said that both James and Victor Miller confessed to her on 4 separate occasions that they killed Willie Nickell. Gwendolyn would, however, refuse to testify during the trial and instead flee all the way to Kansas City, Missouri. Why, I do not know. When Gwendolyn returned to Wyoming in October of 1903, she met with the governor and provided him with a 15-page affidavit that, like I said, included her assertions that James Miller and his son Victor confessed to the killing. There was definitely something fishy going on, though. Governor Chatterton did meet with Gwendolyn in person. He did go over her affidavit, but he would ultimately dismiss her as being devious and agenda-driven. Apparently, she had some sort of weird goal of getting Tom's sentence commuted, and then, once that was done, switching things around and proving that Victor Miller was innocent. Like I said, it was pretty fishy, and District Attorney Stoll would even end up charging Gwendolyn with perjury. Truth is, though, she was not alone in blaming Victor Miller. Other affidavits were submitted by many people who swore that Victor confessed to him. One of them, Ollie Whitman, stated that Victor told him, quote, "My father wanted me to kill him because we were always having trouble together and always fighting," end quote. Even a damn psychic from Denver got involved, claiming that Victor Miller had appeared before him in a vision and claimed guilt for the murder. The rumors were so widespread that a deputy was sent to the Miller homestead to question Victor. The young man denied confessing to any such thing, but he did let it slide that John Coble had recently sent a few of his thugs over to try to pressure him into admitting guilt. Victor ended up meeting with the governor in person, he and his parents, and after a thorough grilling, Chatterton stated that he did not believe Victor was guilty of murdering Willie Nickell. Another surprise affidavit came in the form of Frank Mullock. If you'll recall, he's the guy who said Tom confessed to him and his friends over in Denver. According to Mullock, he got it wrong, and the man he thought was Tom was just somebody who looked like him. Whoopsie. Then there was blacksmith and part-time sheriff's deputy Jack Martin. Now this is pretty big. I alluded to this a moment ago, but according to Martin, Deputy LaForce had accepted a $500 bribe from James Miller to turn a blind eye to he and his sons during the investigation, and to instead focus on Tom Horn as the primary suspect. Worth pointing out, though, that Jack Martin and Tom Horn were friends. They had worked together in the past. Remember that blood-stained sweater? Well, the man who originally ordered the sweater came forward saying that he did indeed order it specifically for Tom Horn. And D.A. Stoll had even gone through the trouble of having it tested. Apparently it was human blood on the sweater. Of course, back in those days, they didn't have any way of determining whose blood it belonged to. In the end, despite all these affidavits, Governor Chatterton said that he failed to find any extenuating circumstances in Tom's case. And even if Deputy LaForce's testimony was withdrawn, there still, quote, remains sufficient evidence to warrant a conviction, end quote. Edward Slack, an editor for Wyoming's Daily Leader, wrote the following. Bearing in mind the verdict of the jury in the case and the penalty imposed by the judge, Governor Chatterton's decision could not have been otherwise. When it is understood in Wyoming that the courts are competent to punish the crime of murder, there will be an end to lynchings by the mobs. The fact is, Tom Horn readily convicted himself by his indiscretion before arrest, by his testimony and bearing in the presence of the jury, and last by his bold attempt to escape, during which he attempted to kill the jailer. End quote. And yeah, I kind of agree. Think about it like this. You ever know anybody to get fired for something trivial, like for being just 1 minute late to work? And then you dig into it a little deeper, and you find out they'd been late to work on many other occasions as well. They'd been slacking on the job and missing days and showing up late, and they were warned over and over again. And then finally, one day they show up 1 minute late and they got the axe. Truth is, they did not get fired for that one time they showed up late, but for all the other bullshit that preceded it. The last time they showed up late was merely the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, I think the same can be said for Tom Horn. He got by with killing Matt Rash and Isom Dart. He got away with killing those two alleged outlaws near Jackson Hole. He got away with killing what was most likely two unarmed prospectors in southern Wyoming. And he got off scot-free after killing Lewis and Powell. Those are the murders that we know of. God only knows what else Tom had gotten up to during the Pleasant Valley War, not to mention his actions up in Johnson County. Or even against the Apache. Let's not forget, according to Charlie Siringo, Tom had even confessed to killing a baby when he was scouting for the Army. And aside from all this killing, just think of how many small ranchers and homesteaders he had terrorized over the years. Tom definitely had a reputation prior to the murder of Willie Nickell, a reputation that he added to by constantly inflating his actions. One of the reasons that Tom is so hard to research is that he took responsibility for more killings than he actually committed. Partly, I'm sure, due to ego, and partly to make his job as a range detective that much more effective. You know, if the targets thought that he was a cold-blooded killer, then they would heed his warnings and clear out of the territory. And there were a lot of people who did. Not Kels Nickell, though. And unfortunately, Nickell's determination ultimately cost the life of his 14-year-old son. With all that said, though, I'm still not sure if I would have found Tom guilty if I were a member of that jury. I'm very much a firm believer in being innocent until proven guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. And I'm also of the belief that it's better for 10 guilty men to go free rather than one innocent man or woman being wrongfully convicted. And as far as Tom is concerned, there is room for at least a little reasonable doubt. I know I keep saying it, but why did Kels Nickell change his mind? Why was he so positive that James Miller, or one of his sons at least, had killed Willie, only to then do a 180 and blame Tom Horn? And what about all those rumors concerning Victor Miller? Were any of them true? Did he really confess to killing Willie, or was it just a smear campaign funded by John Coble? And what about Deputy LaForce? Any truth to the claims that he was bribed by James Miller? Now, there was a mock trial held there in Wyoming back in 1993, with real lawyers and a jury and a retired judge. As I mentioned earlier, LaForce's confession was not considered admissible, but the testimony of Gwendolyn Kimmel was. The defense seemed to really focus on Jack Martin, who said that LaForce accepted a bribe from the Millers. This was not part of the original trial, but it was submitted during the so-called war of affidavits that followed. They also spent quite a bit of time trying to prove that the bullets that killed Willie were not fired from a .30-30 rifle of the sort that Tom was known to have used. And in this mock trial, Tom was found not guilty. And I gotta say, if I were on that jury, I might have done the same. Not so much because I'm fully convinced that Tom was innocent, but I just can't prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Gun to my head, did Tom Horn kill Willie Nickell? Yeah, probably. But I just can't prove it. Now, a few more things on Tom Horn before we wrap up. I get the impression that a lot of people look up to Tom, consider him to sort of be the perfect embodiment of a genuine frontier cowboy. And make no mistake about it, Tom was extremely talented when it came to ranch work. Hell, his skills with the rope were legendary. But then again, Horn did not spend the majority of his life as a cowpoke. Instead, he made a very conscious decision to live by the sword, taking his marching orders from the rich and powerful, first with the Pinkertons, and then as a range detective for the cattle barons. While I have no doubt that Tom did occasionally target actual criminals, he also for sure terrorized innocent people. Remember, the cattle barons didn't care if you were really a stock thief or not. They would just brand you as an outlaw in order to take your land. And one of the tools they used to take said land went by the name of Thomas H. Horn Jr. Tom may have claimed to have hated thieves, but let's be honest, that was not his only motivation as a range detective. Think about it. Tom would give his victims plenty of warning before he killed them. Anytime one of his targets simply packed up and left the territory, Tom let him alone and did not pursue. If he was in it for the justice, then he would have followed and made an arrest, but he didn't. It wasn't until they defied his commands that he killed them. That's ego. If Tom wanted to enforce the law, he could have got a job in law enforcement, pinned on a badge, and done things within the confines of the law. Of course, then again, your run-of-the-mill deputy doesn't get paid nearly as much as a hired killer. It's my opinion that Tom was motivated by money and his own ego more than he was by putting an end to stock theft. I've had a few people contact me during the course of this series saying that we need more men like Tom Horn, and that maybe if he were around nowadays, he could clean out that nest of vipers over in D.C. There's just one thing you're forgetting, though. If Tom was around nowadays, he'd most likely be working for those vipers in D.C., or whoever else was powerful and rich enough to afford his services. Tom Horn did not work for the common man. He did not protect the small ranchers. More often than not, it was the small ranchers he was targeting. And let's not forget that Tom's victims never had the privilege of a trial. They never got to file appeals or enjoy 3 hots and a cot as they lounged in jail, braiding rope and hoping for a pardon. They were simply gunned down in cold blood. So while I don't know for sure that Tom Horn killed Willie Nickell, I also don't look up to him as some type of misunderstood hero. And I also don't really buy into the theory that Tom was set up by the cattle barons. I guess the theory is that they felt like Tom was no longer trustworthy or that he had become a liability, so they allowed him to be executed for a crime he did not commit. While there is some anecdotal evidence pointing to this, you got to keep in mind that John Coble was Tom's direct employer. And Coble did stay true to Horn all the way to the end, even paying for his casket. While it's true that the other big ranchers distanced themselves, I think this was more due to the change in times than anything else. In the years since Horn had first arrived in Wyoming, the population of the state had doubled. There were more sheep than ever, and the power of the WSGA had declined quite a bit. No longer were they in control of the government, and no longer were they able to pull strings like they once could. If Willie had been murdered in 1890, as opposed to 1901, there wouldn't have even been a trial. Tom would have simply been let out of jail, and that would have been that. As it were, though, Horn was executed in the year of our Lord, 1903. The Wild West was gone, and with it, so went the power of the cattle barons. Rather than set him up for a fall, I think it was more likely that they were powerless to help. Don't get it twisted, though. I'm sure a few of them let loose with a sigh of relief when Tom went a-swinging. After all, he did take their secrets, and their secret crimes, with him to the grave. For all his faults, Tom weren't no snitch, and he never offered to roll over on the bosses in exchange for his life. So what do you think? Was Tom Horn guilty or innocent? Was he a hero or just an opportunistic hammer who treated the small homesteaders as nails? Should redheads be allowed to participate in our society? What about people who are left-handed? Or those psychopaths who drive around with 300 rubber ducks on the dash of their Jeep Wranglers? Are they as bad as Tom Horn or worse? Josh at wildwestextra.com. Hit me up and share your thoughts. Now, as far as everybody else, U.S. Deputy Marshal Joe LaForce would go on to live a very long life, finally giving up the ghost in 1940 at the age of 75. Although Joe was instrumental in putting an end to Tom Horn, he didn't really enjoy all that great of a reputation, and even to this day, he's gotten what I like to call the Pat Garrett treatment. John Coble would see to it that Tom's autobiography was published a year after his death. That's something I didn't really bring up earlier, but I probably should have. While Tom was awaiting his execution, he penned his own story, The Life of Tom Horn, Government Scout and Interpreter, as written by himself. The book, which focuses mostly on Tom's actions in Arizona and ends with his arrival in Wyoming, has proved to be very popular over the years, and it is still available if you'd like to check it out for yourself. You can get a copy on Amazon or just read it for free online. Now, like I said, Coble made sure that the book was published, but by that time he had his own set of problems. Ended up going broke to the point of being destitute, and finally, on the 4th of December 1914, John Coble took his own life in an Elko, Nevada hotel room. Kels Nickell would go on to live another 26 years after Tom's execution. Ended up selling that homestead after getting shot and moved the family to Cheyenne. Kels died in Kentucky in 1926 while visiting family, but he was planted there in Cheyenne's Lakeview Cemetery, not far from his boy, Willie. Interestingly enough, Kels was not allowed to attend Tom's execution, but he was permitted to see the body afterwards. I guess the authorities didn't want any conspiracies popping up about Tom's death being faked. Victor Miller, the young man who many think was the true murderer, ended up living all the way until 1964, passing away in Denver at the age of 80. Gwendolyn Kimmel, that school teacher, also lived a long life. Doesn't appear that she ever got married or had children, and she passed away in California in 1949. A lot has been assumed about the going-ons between Gwendolyn and Tom Horn. Many think that they were lovers, and by her own admission, she was attracted to the frontier type. However, evidence does suggest that their relationship was purely platonic. I do like what Gwendolyn had to say about Tom in the appendix of his autobiography, though. Guilty or not, I think it applies, and I think it's a fitting end to this series. Quote, riding hard, drinking hard, fighting hard. So passed his days until he was crushed between the grindstones of two civilizations. End quote. And I reckon that's about all I've got on Tom Horn. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to sign up for that 100% free Wild West newsletter. Doesn't cost a dime, and I did recently send out an edition with several photos of some of these people we've been talking about, sort of like a companion piece to this series. All right, till next time, adios.